Hey guys, welcome to Just Sleep Stories, and tonight we're going somewhere that smells like patchouli, lentils and bad decisions. We're going to a 1960s commune, not the glamorous festival poster version with flower crowns and Joni Mitchell floating through a meadow on a cloud of goodwill. I mean the real thing. The mud floor, share everything, someone ate your last tomato, whose baby is that commune. The kind where the revolution showed up on Monday and by Thursday everyone was arguing about whose turn it was to clean the composting toilet. And yes, there was a composting toilet. Actually calling it a toilet is generous. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. If you want to leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is, go right ahead. Someone always writes in at 2 a.m. from a place I've never heard of, and honestly that's my favourite part of the week. Now dim those lights, maybe pull a blanket over you, and let go of whatever was stressing you out today. Just let it drift. There is nothing you need to fix right now. The dishes can wait, the emails can wait, the group chat can wait, all of it can wait. Now. Have you ever wondered what it was actually like to live in a commune? Did people really believe they could redesign civilization from a converted farmhouse in Vermont? Did everyone actually share everything? Or was there always one person quietly hoarding the good coffee? How do you divide chores between 30 adults who all believe that traditional authority structures are a form of violence? What do you eat when the harvest fails, the goat escapes, and the only person who knows how to bake bread has gone on a vision quest? Could you survive one full week without a door that locks, a shower that reliably produces hot water, and a single conversation that doesn't somehow circle back to the redistribution of wealth? Would you last even 48 hours before quietly fantasizing about your own spoon? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1968. You're lying on a mattress on the floor of what used to be a barn in rural New Mexico. There are 17 other people in this building, at least 2 of whom are playing guitar. Breakfast is communal, the rules are theoretical, and someone has written the word love on the wall in red paint, right next to the rotating chore chart that absolutely no one is following. Good luck. Let's talk about the moment you actually arrive. You've driven 14 hours in a van held together by bumper stickers and collective optimism. You turn off a paved road, then a gravel road, then something that is technically neither. You park in a field. A man with very long hair and no shoes jogs toward you, arms wide open, beaming like he expected you specifically, which is strange because no one knew you were coming. He says your name is no longer important, that names are a construct, and hands you a carved wooden cup of something warm and slightly mossy. This is home now. Your luggage is already being sorted by 3 strangers who are very excited to share resources. You feel a feeling that is somewhere between freedom and low-grade panic, and the line between those 2 things will not get clearer for the next several weeks. The van smells like engine oil, dried herbs, and the particular optimism of someone who's read too many pamphlets and not enough books about actual farming. You've been on the road since before dawn, sustained by gas station coffee and the conviction that you're doing something brave. You left behind an apartment, a job, a mother who called twice a week and asked when you were coming back. You told her you were finding yourself. She told you yourself was right there in the apartment where you'd left it. You drove away anyway. The field you've parked in is beautiful, genuinely. The light is doing something golden and generous across the tall grass, and there are mountains in the distance, and for a moment it looks exactly like the poster in your head. Then you get out of the van and step directly into mud that reaches your ankle, with a sucking, deliberate sound, like the land itself saying welcome, and also, you are not in charge here. The barefoot man, his commune name is River, though he was born Gerald in Cincinnati, is still talking. He's telling you about the energy of the land, the vision of the founding group. The way this place is going to prove that another world is possible, he is very sincere. He has not slept a full night since the last person arrived 2 weeks ago, because every new arrival requires a welcome conversation that lasts until the candles burn down. You will learn this later. Right now you are still nodding. Someone takes your bag into what they call the main house. It is a farmhouse built sometime around 1920 that has been added to, modified, painted, repainted, and philosophically repurposed several times. The kitchen is bigger than you expected. The bathroom situation is smaller than you hoped. There is a hand-lettered sign above the door that reads, "We are the world we are trying to build," which is the kind of sentence that sounds true and also slightly threatening depending on your mood. You're introduced to 11 people in the first hour. They have names like Sage and Cedar, and one woman who simply goes by the artist, which she says with no irony at all. Everyone shakes your hand or hugs you or both. A child of indeterminate age runs past your knees carrying a chicken with the focused urgency of someone on a very important errand. Nobody explains the chicken. By evening, you're sitting in a circle on the floor of the main room, knee to knee with people you met 4 hours ago, eating something warm from a communal pot, listening to a man with a beard that has its own weather system explain what life here requires of you. Presence, he says. Openness. A willingness to dissolve the self in service of the whole. You nod. You're very tired. The soup is surprisingly good. The floor is hard. Somewhere outside, the goat is making a sound that will become, over the following weeks, as familiar to you as your own heartbeat. You have arrived. Whatever that means, you have arrived. Every commune runs on meetings, long ones, deeply existentially long ones. Tonight's gathering starts at 7 in the main house, which is really just the room with the most candles and the least amount of structural damage. Everyone sits in a circle on the floor because circles represent equality, and because all the chairs were repurposed into a chicken coop last spring by someone who thought it was a beautiful statement about shelter being a right, not a privilege. The agenda, written in smudged pencil on a paper bag, has 12 items. You will not reach item 3. Someone raises a concern about how the word agenda itself implies hierarchy, and the next 90 minutes belong to that conversation alone. You stare into the candle flame and wonder if this is what democracy feels like from the inside. It feels like this. A lower back that is already aching from the floor, a mind that is trying very hard to follow a conversation that has now branched into 4 simultaneous conversations, and the creeping awareness that the meeting started at 7, and it is now 9, and the only thing that has been formally decided is that the word agenda will be replaced by the word intention. Someone wrote that down. It is on the paper bag now. Below the original 12 items, none of which have been discussed. In the outside world, meetings are bad. Everyone agrees on this. Meetings are the thing you endure before you can go back to actually doing the work. But at least outside meetings have a chairperson, a clock, and the implicit understanding that there is a room to escape to afterward. In the commune meeting, there is no escape room. You are already in the room. You will sleep in this room later, and the people whose voices are now explaining why the compost rotation represents an unexamined power dynamic are the same people who will be breathing near you at midnight. The consensus model, which is the commune's chosen decision-making framework, requires that every voice be heard and that no decision be made until everyone can genuinely live with the outcome. This is a beautiful idea. It is also an idea that was designed for a world where the decisions are about something manageable, like whether to plant beans this season, not about whether the concept of designated sleeping spaces reflects an unhealthy attachment to private property. The second question takes longer. There is always one member who speaks in very long, very calm sentences and somehow makes everything more complicated without technically being wrong about anything. There is always one member who says, "I just want to name something," before naming approximately 7 things. There is always one member who falls asleep sitting upright and wakes sharply at the sound of their name, says, "I think we need to hear from everyone on this," and goes back to sleep before anyone can respond. By 10 o'clock, item 1 has been resolved. The word agenda is gone. The compost rotation has been tabled for a subcommittee that will be formed at the next meeting, and there is a palpable collective sense of accomplishment that you find both touching and bewildering. People are hugging. Someone says this was a really beautiful process. The candles are burning low. Tomorrow there will be another meeting to address the remaining 11 items, plus the new items that tonight generated, plus 1 item that somebody just remembered. You crawl to your corner of the sleeping room, lie down on your mattress, and stare at the ceiling. Outside, the stars are enormous. Somewhere in the dark, the guitar starts up again, a gentle looping chord that fills the silence left by 12 unresolved agenda items. You fall asleep anyway, because the day has been long and the floor is hard and the world, for all its complications, is very quiet out here past the edge of the road. Let's talk about your living situation. If you came expecting a rustic but charming private room, with a window and perhaps a small writing desk, where you could journal your spiritual awakening, adjust that expectation downward, significantly. Your space is a corner of a larger room separated from the rest of the world by a curtain that used to be a bedsheet, and before that, possibly a tablecloth, And before that, who can say? On one side of the curtain is your mattress, your bag, and whatever you can balance on top of a wooden crate. On the other side of the curtain is everyone else, all the time. The concept of privacy in a commune is less a reality, and more of a mutually agreed upon polite fiction. The idea that if no one acknowledges you can hear everything, then functionally you cannot. Your mattress is on the floor. This is not a complaint exactly, it is simply accurate. It was someone else's mattress before it was yours, and before that it may have been a door, based on the structural confidence it does not have. It sags in the middle in a way that suggests it has already processed one person's existential crisis, and is not sure it has the energy for another. You sleep on it anyway because the floor is harder, and the alternative is a sleeping bag on the floor, which two people in this room are already doing by choice as a statement about attachment to comfort. Your wooden crate serves as a nightstand, a bookshelf, and a writing surface when you balance a notebook on it at the precise angle that stops it from sliding. On the crate, a candle, a book, your journal, a cup of water you fill before bed, and which already has something small floating in it that you have decided not to examine. This is your kingdom. You have approximately 60 square feet, and they are yours in the same way that a park bench is yours, available to you, associated with you, but technically belonging to everyone. The curtain offers the illusion of privacy, which is its own gift. Behind it, you can be alone with your thoughts in a conceptual sense, even while the sounds of the room move freely through the fabric. Someone turning over on their mattress, the muffled conversation of two people who think they are being quiet, the guitar, always, somewhere, the guitar, and the particular breathing rhythms of 18 people in various stages of sleep. You learn, quickly, to build an interior wall of focus. You learn to be alone inside your own skull regardless of what your ears are doing. Possessions here exist in a grey zone. The founding philosophy holds that material attachment is a source of suffering, and that resources should flow freely through the community. In practice, this means that your things are safe if they are either clearly personal, a letter from your mother, your one good pen, or clearly communal from the start. What falls into the complicated middle is everything else. Your extra shirt, your good wool socks, the bar of chocolate you brought from the last town, and have been rationing with the focused discipline of a person who has learned that communal chocolate disappears faster than communal lentils. You have a hook on the wall beside your curtain. On the hook, your jacket, your hat, and a small drawing someone left there as a gift the second morning, a loose sketch of the mountains done in pencil on the back of an envelope. You do not know who left it. You did not ask. You kept it, because it is the first private, quiet, beautiful thing in a life that is currently very loud and very shared, and some nights, lying on your slightly collapsed mattress, listening to the commune settle into sleep around you, you look at that drawing and feel something that is not quite loneliness, and not quite contentment, but lives somewhere between the two, in the particular territory of a life being genuinely uncomfortably changed. It is time for breakfast, and the kitchen is already a full-contact philosophical event. The communal kitchen is the beating, chaotic, slightly smoky heart of every commune that has ever existed. Everything here is shared. The pots, the food, the opinions about the food, and the lingering guilt about whether your approach to scrambling eggs is actually a manifestation of your unexamined bourgeois conditioning. The stove is a salvaged gas range with 2 working burners and one that ignites only when it feels like it, which is rarely and without warning. There is always someone already in the kitchen when you arrive, no matter what time it is, chopping something root-shaped and explaining to no one in particular why the food system in America is broken. The kitchen runs on a system that is less a system, and more a collective improvisation that has calcified, over time, into something that resembles tradition. Breakfast is whenever people are awake enough to make it. Lunch is theoretical. Dinner is communal and happens when whoever has cooking duty that day manages to produce something from whatever is available, which changes with the season, the harvest, and the frequency with which the goat has gotten into the garden. The cooking rotation is on the chore chart. The chore chart is on the wall. What this means in practice is discussed in the next segment, but for now it is enough to say that the person who cooked last night is also, somehow, still doing most of the cooking this morning. The pots are enormous and few. You cook for 18 people with the equipment of someone who once hosted a dinner party for 6 and did not entirely manage it. The large pot on the back burner has been in continuous use since before you arrived. passed from cook to cook like a relay baton, its contents changing but its base flavours accumulating into something that by now is its own distinct substance. It is warm, it is filling, and it tastes like every vegetable the commune has grown since April, all at once, together, resolved into a kind of unified theory of stew. There are rules about the kitchen, posted on a piece of cardboard above the sink. They're handwritten in 4 different colours of marker, suggesting they were added to at different times and by different people with different levels of urgency. Clean what you use. Do not take more than your share. Ask before using the last of something. Respect the communal pantry. The communal pantry is a set of shelves in the corner, holding bags of lentils, dry beans, rice, oats, jars of things that were preserved in the summer, and a small locked tin that everyone knows contains the good tea, and that is officially shared, but that practically speaking requires a specific kind of courage to open in front of other people. The kitchen table seats 8 if everyone agrees to be uncomfortable, which they do, because discomfort in service of community is a value that has been explicitly discussed at a meeting. The other 10 people eat standing, leaning against counters, sitting on the floor near the door or taking their bowls back to their corners. Mealtimes are the commune's most reliable social ritual, the one time each day when everyone is doing the same thing at roughly the same time, which creates a kind of enforced togetherness that manages to be both its most exhausting and its most genuinely warm quality. Someone always has something to say about the food. Not complaining exactly, complaining about communal food is its own complicated social act, implying ingratitude toward whoever cooked and toward the labour and philosophy behind communal eating as a practice. But noting things, observations, the oats are from the old bag, the bread is a bit dense today, the apples are going. These observations float across the kitchen like weather, noticed and responded to with murmurs that could mean anything, and the meal continues, and the pot on the back burner keeps simmering, and outside the window the garden is either thriving or not. And either way, someone will be out there after breakfast, hands in the dirt doing the work that makes this possible, which is the part nobody put on the poster, but which is, it turns out, most of the actual story. You want to understand the commune diet? Picture the colour brown. Now picture it in soup form. Now picture it every day for 6 weeks. The 1960s commune was, nutritionally speaking, an endurance sport. The philosophy was simple. Grow your own food, eat what the land provides, reject the industrial food complex, and above all, waste nothing. The reality was that the land, at least in the first year or two, provided primarily zucchini, questionable greens, and a surplus of lentils so abundant that they began to feel less like a food and more like a consequence. Meat was largely absent, not just for economic reasons, but because several members had arrived with strong feelings about the spiritual cost of eating animals, and those feelings were vocal and frequently expressed at mealtimes. The lentil was not always on the menu. In theory, the commune's diet was seasonal, varied, and aligned with the rhythms of the land. In summer, there were tomatoes, beans, squash, cucumbers, and the momentary glory of a good corn harvest that everyone remembered for years afterward as proof that this could work. In autumn, there were root vegetables, late greens, apples from the 2 trees at the edge of the property, and the preserving sessions in which large quantities of whatever was ripening got processed into jars that lined the pantry shelves in colourful, satisfying rows. These were the good weeks. People felt in those weeks like the project was proving something. Then came the long stretch of months when the garden was dormant and the pantry's colourful jars began to dwindle, and the answer to the question of what was for dinner became again lentils. Lentils with rice, lentils with barley, lentils with the last of the preserved tomatoes from August, which improved the situation meaningfully. Lentil soup that had been left on the stove so long it had become, structurally speaking, more of a lentil paste. The commune developed an extensive and sincere vocabulary for lentil preparation, because when you are eating something that often, you either learn to love it or you lose your mind, and most people, to their credit, chose love. Bread was the other pillar of the commune table, and the bread was serious. Not in a precious artisan way, but in a practical load-bearing way. The bread was what stood between you and a meal that was only lentils, and so the bread mattered enormously. There was always someone who was the best bread baker, and that person occupied a position of quiet social power that no founding document had anticipated, but everyone understood. When the bread was good, the evening was good. When the bread was dense, and sometimes it was very dense, dense enough to require real commitment from your jaw, the meal was still fine because it was warm and it was shared, and outside the windows the dark was big and the fire was small and you were here together, which was the whole point. Spices were scarce and treated accordingly, salt was measured, pepper was celebrated. A jar of cumin arriving in a supply run from town was greeted with the quiet gratitude of people who have recently discovered how much a single spice can do for a pot of lentils. Someone once traded a hand-woven basket at the town market for a small bottle of hot sauce, and the hot sauce lasted 3 months because everyone used it sparingly, and with the focused appreciation of people who know what it is to eat without it. What you ate in the commune was not what you would have chosen. But there was something it gave you, and you noticed it slowly over the weeks, in the way you thought about food. The way a meal became something you were genuinely grateful for, rather than something you had ordered and expected. The first tomato of the summer from your own garden. The bread that came out right. The evening when someone found wild garlic near the creek, and the soup tasted briefly and magnificently like something you would have paid for in a restaurant in the city you no longer lived in. You ate together, you were warm. The lentils were, by the end, genuinely fine. Somewhere on the wall of every commune that ever drew breath hangs a chore chart. It is almost always handmade, almost always written in multiple colours of marker, and almost always ignored by at least a third of the people whose names appear on it. The chore chart represents one of humanity's most persistent and touching delusions, that if you simply write down who is supposed to do what and post it somewhere visible, the thing will happen. In a commune of 20 people, with deeply individual interpretations of personal responsibility and a shared suspicion of authority, the chore chart functions less as a schedule and more as a conversation starter. Someone always has a nuanced critique of why the current system is hierarchical. Someone else is on a fast. The dishes sit in the sink and acquire a small civilization of their own. The chore chart was born out of necessity and optimism in equal measure. In the early weeks, the commune tried operating without one, on the theory that in a community of people genuinely committed to shared life, tasks would be taken up organically by whoever saw they needed doing. What actually happened was that 3 people did everything and were quietly furious about it. 4 people did things selectively and considered themselves contributors, and the rest operated on a belief system in which their contributions were invisible but real, manifesting in ways that the chore chart would never capture. The chore chart was proposed, discussed at a meeting, revised at a second meeting, and posted on the wall on a Tuesday with a sense of collective relief that lasted approximately 4 days. The categories are logical: cooking, dishes, cleaning, water carrying, garden work, animal care, firewood, and a category simply labelled general that is everyone's favourite, because it means nothing specific and can be interpreted as complete after virtually any activity. You fixed a fence post? General. You swept an area near the door? General. You had a long conversation with a new arrival about the philosophy of shared labour? Arguably general. The general category is where ambition goes to rest. The enforcement question is the chore chart's central philosophical problem. In a community that has rejected hierarchy, who tells someone their dishes are still in the sink? The answer, theoretically, is everyone. Any member of the community can raise a concern in the appropriate meeting space. In practice, the people who raise chore-related concerns at meetings are the same 3 people who were doing everything before the chore chart was invented, and raising the concern cost them something socially, a slight tarnishing of the easygoing collaborative spirit they are meant to embody, so they raise it less often than the situation warrants, and the situation continues. There is always one person on the commune who is legendary for their chore avoidance. They are not lazy, exactly. They work intensely on projects they have chosen, with great energy and visible commitment. They just have a gift for being somewhere else when the dishes need doing, for emerging from deep conversation at the precise moment the water has already been carried and the wood already stacked, for contributing to the commune in ways that are real but unmeasurable by any chart that has ever been made. Everyone knows who this person is. It is discussed, cautiously, in 2s and 3s. At the meeting, they speak eloquently about the importance of trusting each person's contribution. They receive murmurs of agreement. The dishes remain. By the end, the chore chart is not a failure. It is a document of something true about human nature, that even people who have genuinely chosen to live differently who have given up apartments and salaries and the privacy of their own spoons to build something new, still carry with them the ancient human preference for doing the tasks they like and finding reasons why the others don't count. The chore chart hangs on the wall. Some of the names have faded. The dishes on a good day get done, and tomorrow there will be a meeting about refining the system, and someone will suggest a new colour of marker, and the chart will be revised, and the commune will try again, which is its own kind of stubborn, impractical, oddly moving heroism. Let's talk about bathing, and I will warn you now that the conversation does not go anywhere warm. Most communes in the 1960s started life in a property that was either very old, very rural, or both, which meant the plumbing situation was best described as aspirational. Hot water, when it existed, was a shared and finite resource, and the social calculus of who showered and for how long became one of the more quietly contentious issues in commune life. Some properties had outdoor showers rigged to solar-heated barrels, wonderful in July, genuinely dangerous in October. Others had a single indoor bathroom for 20 people, which meant the morning queue stretched back into the hallway, and the concept of a leisurely shower was a distant memory from your previous capitalist life. The outdoor shower in the summer months was genuinely not bad. The barrel spent all day absorbing heat from the sun, and by late afternoon it could produce water that was warm enough to be called a shower rather than a punishment. You stood on a wooden pallet over the mud, surrounded by a curtain of canvas hung between 4 posts, and you washed with a bar of soap that lived on a small shelf and belonged to everyone, including the rain. Birds were nearby. The sky was above you. There was something in it, a kind of simplicity that you had not expected to like as much as you did. You got clean, approximately. You dried off with a towel that was damp from the last person. You walked back inside feeling briefly and genuinely fine about everything. In October, the outdoor shower revealed its limitations. The barrel, now receiving far less sun, produced water that ranged from cool to cold to something that registered in your nervous system less as a temperature and more as an event. You learned to shower very quickly. You learned to regard the cold as bracing, then character building, then simply a fact of this life that required no further commentary. You noticed that your standards for what constituted acceptable cleanliness had shifted meaningfully since you arrived, in the direction of less demanding. The commune as a whole had developed this shift together, quietly, without a meeting, which was one of the few collective decisions that required no discussion at all. The indoor bathroom, where it existed, was a different kind of negotiation. One toilet, one sink, one tub or shower stall with water heated by a system that worked reliably on roughly 2/3 of the days it was asked to work. The queue in the morning had its own etiquette, unwritten but understood. You did not take long, you did not use all the hot water, and you did not occupy the bathroom for any reason other than the reason a bathroom exists, because there were 16 people behind you, and they had things to do, and the morning was already going. The person who took long showers was known. The person who did it twice in a week was discussed. Some communes built outhouses as a matter of philosophy as much as necessity, a rejection of the indoor plumbing that tied you to municipal systems and the whole apparatus of modern infrastructure. The outhouse was a small wooden structure at a purposeful distance from the main house, equipped with a seat over a pit, a supply of whatever was being used instead of toilet paper this week, and a door that latched from the inside with a hook that was either very secure or completely inadequate depending on the wind. In winter, the walk to the outhouse was its own meditative practice, best undertaken quickly and with the focused intention of someone who has somewhere specific to be, and minimal interest in lingering. What you discovered, in the bathroom situation, was the same thing the commune kept teaching you in different rooms and under different circumstances. That what you thought you needed, and what you actually needed were not always the same thing, and the distance between them was smaller than you had assumed. You needed to be clean enough. You needed water that did not actively hurt you. You needed a door that closed. Everything beyond that was, it turned out, negotiable. This was either a valuable lesson about the nature of necessity or a coping mechanism for a cold barrel shower in November. Possibly both. The commune, in its wisdom or its infrastructure deficiency, did not always distinguish between the two. Sleeping arrangements in the 1960s commune were a topic of remarkable ideological range. Some communes practice fairly conventional sleeping, individuals and couples in their own corners, separated by curtains or plywood partitions, with a general understanding that your sleeping space was your own business. Others, however, embraced something more ambitious. The free love movement had arrived with the 60s like a houseguest who never quite left, and in some commune spaces the boundaries between sleeping, socialising and communal living were genuinely fluid. The result was sleeping arrangements that would require a diagram, several conversations about jealousy as a capitalist construct, and one extremely honest journal entry to fully explain to an outsider. The communal sleeping room, in its most basic form, was simply the practical solution to a space problem. You had a farmhouse with 3 bedrooms and 20 people, and the math did not work out in anyone's favour if everyone wanted a private room. So you shared. You put your mattress in the large upstairs room alongside 11 other mattresses, arranged with the careful geometry of people trying to give each other dignity, within a small square footage. You oriented your head toward the wall and your feet toward the centre, and you developed quickly the skill of being in a room with other people in a way that felt private, a retreat into the interior life that the curtain around your corner only symbolised. What nobody tells you about sleeping communally is the warmth of it, and not just the literal warmth, though that was real too. The shared body heat in a building without reliable heating, making the sleeping room noticeably warmer than the hallway outside. There was something else, a quality of not being alone in the night that was different from anything a city apartment could offer. The sounds of other people sleeping, breathing, occasionally murmuring in dreams created a texture to the darkness that was, once you stopped fighting it, genuinely comforting. You were not alone. Whatever the day had been, whatever the meeting had unresolved, you were here in the dark with other people who had also chosen this, and there was a strange solidarity in the shared unconsciousness of it. The complications arrived, as they often do, at the intersection of ideology and human feeling. The free love conversations, and they happened, openly, in meetings and around meals and in the long evenings, were earnest and genuinely exploratory, full of people trying to think clearly about attachment and jealousy and what it meant to love someone without claiming them. The theory was beautiful. It was worked out in language with great care and good faith. The practice, as anyone who has ever felt jealous in the middle of the night in a room with no walls and limited curtains can attest, was more complicated than the language. Couples existed, reformed, dissolved, and reformed again in the close quarters of the commune with a speed that the outside world would have found bewildering, but that inside felt, on good days, like a natural consequence of people being genuinely alive to each other. On less good days it felt like a logistical problem with no clean solution and a chore chart that now had emotional stakes attached to it. Who slept where mattered in ways the founding document had not anticipated, and the meeting structure was not quite equipped to handle. What most people settled into eventually was something quieter than the theory, and warmer than the fear. You found your corner, you knew your neighbours on either side, you learned the sounds of the room well enough to sleep through most of them, and wake for the ones that needed attention. The morning brought everyone back to the kitchen and the stove and the lentils and the shared work of the day, and the night's complications were carried quietly, processed privately, in the 60 square feet behind your curtain that the commune had agreed, without ever stating it formally, belonged to you. Every commune worth its hand-thrown pottery had a founding document. It had different names, a charter, a manifesto, a living agreement, a covenant, but it always had the same essential quality. It was written with great passion, extraordinary optimism, and a complete failure to anticipate what happens when you put 20 actual humans in a building together with limited hot water and an ambiguous policy on personal food storage. The founding documents of communes from this era are genuinely moving to read. They speak of equality, of shared labour, of breaking down the barriers that industrial capitalism had erected between people and their own humanity. They describe the commune as a living experiment in how human beings might organise themselves without exploitation or hierarchy. Then comes week 3, and someone has eaten the communal cheese again. The founding document was written, typically, by the 2 or 3 people who had the original vision and the most time to sit with it before anyone else arrived. It was drafted in a burst of clarity that felt to the people writing it like the articulation of something obvious and true that the world had simply failed to notice yet. It used words like collective, shared, consensual, intentional, and liberation with the frequency and conviction of people who had recently discovered those words and not yet had time to find out where their edges were. It was beautiful. Several people cried when it was read aloud at the founding gathering. Someone framed a copy and put it on the wall next to the chore chart. The First Amendment came in week 2. It concerned food storage and whether individual members could maintain personal reserves or whether all food needed to flow through the communal pantry. This had not seemed like a question that required addressing in the founding document. Of course, food would be shared, that was the whole point, but it turned out to be a question with more edges than it appeared, because people had different relationships to scarcity, different comfort levels with communal abundance, and at least 2 members who had experienced genuine food insecurity in their lives before the Commune, and for whom the idea of a pantry they did not personally control was not ideologically interesting but physiologically frightening. The amendment was added. The document grew. By month 3, the founding document had been revised 4 times and annotated in the margins in at least 3 different handwriting styles. There was a section on conflict resolution that had been added after the first major conflict and that everyone agreed was necessary and no one had used, because using it required admitting you were in a conflict, which felt like a failure, which the document also said was not a useful framework, but which people felt anyway. There was a section on visitors that was vaguer than anyone wanted, because making it specific required predicting what kinds of visitors would arrive, and nobody had yet anticipated the specific category of person who would show up, eat communal food for 2 weeks, offer no labour, and leave a single abstract oil painting as compensation. What the founding document could not do, however carefully it was written and however many times it was revised, was tell you what to do with the fact that people were people, that even people who had chosen this, who had driven away from everything familiar to build something new, arrived carrying the full weight of who they were, their histories, their wounds, their habits, their instinctive responses to scarcity and conflict and love. The document assumed a level of availability to transformation that was always real, but never total, because transformation is a slow process and the dishes needed doing now. It stayed on the wall. People consulted it, referred to it in meetings, pointed to specific passages in moments of dispute with the particular energy of someone citing scripture. And it worked, in the way that documents work, not by solving the problems it described, but by naming a set of values that gave the community something to aim at, even when they fell short, even when the cheese was gone and the chore chart was ignored, and the meeting had just entered its 3rd hour on item 1. The founding document said what this was supposed to be. The living was the rest of it. The garden was always the dream. The garden was the symbol, the proof, the answer to the question of what happens when people step off the consumer treadmill and reconnect with the land that feeds them. In pamphlets and manifestos and late-night conversations, the commune garden was a place of abundance and dignity, rows of vegetables stretching toward a sun that seemed kinder here, outside the city, outside the machine. And then you actually had to grow a garden, which it turns out is an activity that requires knowledge, back strength, patience, access to decent soil, the right seeds at the right time, consistent water, protection from pests, protection from your own idealistic incompetence, and a goat that does not eat everything the moment you look away. Most commune members arrived from cities. Most had never grown anything more demanding than a houseplant. The first spring was the most honest season. You broke ground in March on soil that had not been cultivated in years, possibly decades, which meant the top layer was hard-packed and the layer beneath it was compacted clay with the agricultural generosity of a parking lot. You borrowed tools from a neighbour who looked at your group with the patient expression of someone watching a slow-motion event they have seen before. You turned the soil by hand, in shifts, in weather that could not decide whether it was winter or spring and kept suggesting it might be both. Your back informed you, around day 3, that it had opinions about this project. You kept going. The seed planning happened with great enthusiasm in February, spread across the kitchen table, seed catalogues and hand-drawn diagrams everywhere, everyone contributing suggestions with the energy of people who were designing abundance from scratch. You planned for tomatoes, peppers, squash, beans, corn, greens, herbs, cucumbers, and a section of flowers because someone felt strongly that beauty was not a luxury, but a necessity, and flowers belonged in a revolutionary garden. The plan was thorough. The plan was optimistic. The plan assumed conditions, soil quality, rainfall patterns, the competence of the gardeners that would need to be negotiated with reality over the following months. What grew in that first year was instructive. The zucchini grew with a confidence that bordered on aggression. You planted 4 plants, and by August they were producing zucchini of a size and frequency that began to feel less like a harvest and more like a message. The beans came up, the greens came up, the tomatoes came up slowly, went sideways for a while, and eventually produced enough to be deeply appreciated without being sufficient for the 20 people who had been anticipating them since April. The corn was eaten by something before you could identify what something was. The peppers were small but genuine. The flowers grew beautifully, and nobody said anything about the practicality question because the flowers were, in fact, necessary. By the 2nd and 3rd year, something shifted. The gardeners who stayed long enough to accumulate knowledge became genuinely skilled. Not farmers in the full sense, but people who understood this specific soil, this specific sun angle, these specific pests and their habits and their preferences. They learned to amend the soil with compost from the pile behind the barn. They learned which varieties did well in this climate and which catalogue promises were aspirational. They learned the physical rhythm of the work, the way to move through a long day in the garden without destroying your knees, the pace that was sustainable rather than dramatic. The garden became, in the end, the thing the founding documents had promised, but more quietly than anyone expected. Not a complete solution, not total self-sufficiency, that turned out to require more land, more skill, and more years than most communes had available, but a real connection to food, to seasonality, to the particular satisfaction of eating something. You grew from a seed you planted in ground you turned with your own hands. The tomato in August, warm from the vine, eaten standing in the garden before it even made it to a bowl, the moment that made all the aching backs and failed corn and goat incursions, briefly, completely worth it. There was almost always a goat, sometimes 2 goats. On a few notable occasions, more goats than anyone had agreed to in advance, because goats have their own agenda, and it does not always align with the commune's founding document. The goat was acquired for excellent reasons: milk, cheese, a sense of self-sufficiency, a living symbol of the commune's rejection of the corporate dairy industry. What the goat provided, in practice, was a daily reminder that animals are not ideologically aligned with their owners. The goat escaped at least once a week. The goat ate things that were not food, or rather, the goat disputed the commune's definition of not food with remarkable consistency. The goat found the garden, the goat found the laundry line. The goat once walked through an open door into the main meeting room during a discussion about collective decision-making, and several people took it as a sign. The goat's name was, depending on which commune member you asked, either a meaningful name drawn from mythology or nature, Demeter, Willow, Solstice, or simply the goat, which is what most people called it regardless of what it had been officially named at the small ceremony that accompanied its arrival. The ceremony had been lovely. Someone read a passage about the relationship between humans and animals in pre-industrial societies. Someone else made a small wreath of herbs and placed it briefly around the goat's neck, at which point the goat ate the wreath and head-butted the person who had placed it, and the commune had its first lesson in what it meant to share a property with this particular animal. Goat milk was the justification, and the goat milk was real and genuinely good. On mornings when the milking went smoothly, which required the right person, in the right mood, approaching the goat with the specific combination of firmness and calm that the goat respected, there was fresh milk for the oats, and occasionally enough surplus to attempt cheese, which the commune's most ambitious cook would then culture and press and age with a seriousness that the rest of the operation rarely matched. The cheese was, when it worked, extraordinary. A soft, sharp, handmade thing that tasted like proof of concept. It appeared at dinner on a board with bread and whatever was left of the summer's preserved vegetables, and everyone ate it with the quiet satisfaction of people who understood exactly how much had gone into it. The milking, however, required catching the goat first. This was the part the idealistic literature on smallholding had not fully addressed. The goat had views on being caught, and those views were negative, and it expressed them with a combination of speed, agility, and strategic use of the commune's terrain that suggested it had been studying the property layout with intentions of its own. A standard goat-catching operation involved at least 3 people, a length of rope, and a loss of dignity that none of the participants would fully describe at the subsequent meeting. You approached from different angles. The goat assessed your angles and selected a 4th one you had not considered. You reconvened. You tried again. Eventually, through persistence or luck or a strategic deployment of the small amount of grain the commune kept in a tin for exactly this purpose, the goat was caught and milked and released back into the field to begin planning tomorrow's escape. The fence was rebuilt 4 times in the first year. Each rebuilding incorporated the lessons of the previous escape. Higher here, reinforced there, the gap near the old oak post addressed with additional wire. The goat studied each new configuration with apparent interest and found the new gap within 48 hours, not because it was malicious, but because it was a goat, and goats exist in a state of continuous cheerful problem-solving that humans have never fully appreciated or adequately planned for. There is a concept in engineering called the adversarial user, the person who will find every weakness in a system not out of spite, but simply by being themselves. The goat was the commune's adversarial user, and the commune's fencing was its system, and the system lost consistently. What the goat gave the commune, beyond milk and chaos and the occasional meeting room visitation, was a daily dose of humility. You could draft a manifesto, you could build a consensus, you could redesign the terms on which human beings organise their collective life. You could not make the goat cooperate, and there was something in that, something about the limits of ideology in the face of a living creature with its own preferences, that the commune needed to learn, and the goat, in its relentless autonomous way, taught it every single day. Nobody arrives at a commune to talk about money. Money is exactly the thing they came to get away from, the great abstraction that capitalism had turned into the measure of human worth, the root cause of alienation, the thing that stood between people and their authentic selves. And yet, the land needs to be paid for, the seeds need to be bought, the van needs gas, the generator needs fuel, and at some point someone needs a dental filling that cannot be bartered for zucchini. The money question is the commune's most persistent and awkward houseguest, the one everyone agreed not to invite and who showed up anyway and helped herself to whatever was in the fridge. Different communes solved this differently. Communal work funds, craft sales at markets, small farming operations, the occasional trust fund that one member quietly contributed while everyone pretended not to notice. The trust fund situation was more common than the founding documents would suggest. The 1960s counterculture drew from a remarkably wide social range. Working-class kids escaping the factory towns their parents had built their lives around, middle-class college graduates rejecting the professional futures their educations had aimed them toward, and a smaller, but financially significant number of people whose families had money, real money. The kind that arrived in quarterly disbursements from accounts managed by people in suits, in cities they had theoretically left behind. These members contributed to the communal fund with a generosity that was genuine and a discretion that was mutual. Nobody wanted to talk about where the money came from, because talking about it would require acknowledging that the commune's independence from the capitalist system was, in certain structural ways, partial. The craft economy was the more ideologically comfortable revenue stream, and it was real. Communes produced things with their hands: pottery, woven textiles, leather goods, candles, hand-bound books, dried herb bundles, preserves, and they sold these things at farmers' markets, craft fairs, and the small network of alternative shops that existed in most cities by the late 1960s, stocked by and for the same cultural movement that had built the communes in the first place. The work was genuine, and the products were good, and the income was modest and inconsistent, which meant it covered some things some months and nothing things other months, and required constant supplementing from other sources. Some communes leaned into farming as a revenue model, with more seriousness than their initial idealism had anticipated, selling vegetables at market, raising animals for sale, growing specific crops for wholesale. These activities required a level of business orientation that sat uneasily with the anti-capitalist framework, but the pragmatism eventually forced. You could not eat the founding document. The mortgage, in communes that had one, arrived on the first of every month with the cheerful indifference of a document that had no interest in your philosophical position. The money conversations, when they finally happened, and they always eventually happened, usually precipitated by a specific crisis, a repair bill that exceeded what was in the communal jar, a property tax due date that had been collectively not thought about until it could not be not thought about any longer, were among the most revealing conversations the commune had. They exposed the gap between what people believed about equality and what they actually practiced, the different relationships members had to scarcity and risk and the future, and the specific discomfort of people who had grown up with financial security, sitting in a circle with people who had not, all nominally sharing the same pot but bringing very different things to it. What the money problem taught the commune, slowly and imperfectly, was that building a different world required engaging with the actual world in all its tedious financial specificity. You needed a budget. You needed someone willing to be the person who tracked the budget, which was a role nobody wanted because it felt like the most capitalist job in the community, and because the person who did it inevitably became the bearer of bad news. You needed, eventually, to be honest with each other about what you each had and what you each needed, which turned out to be one of the more genuinely radical conversations the commune could have, more radical, in its honesty and difficulty, than any manifesto ever written in a burst of collective inspiration at the kitchen table. Children in a commune were, theoretically, the most liberated children in history. They were to be raised collectively, free from the rigid hierarchies of the nuclear family, free from authoritarian parenting, free to develop their authentic selves in an environment of love and communal support. The adults around them would model equality, creativity, and cooperative living. The children would grow up knowing, bone deep, that another way was possible. In practice, children raised in communes were also frequently feral. Not in a sad way, in a cheerful, confident, mud-covered, knows-no-rules way that was sometimes wonderful and sometimes meant that one had eaten lunch at a recognisable hour, or learned to read by the expected developmental milestone. Every adult was technically responsible for the children, which meant that in moments of chaos, every adult assumed someone else was handling it. The commune children moved through the property with a freedom that was genuinely rare for children of their era. The 1960s was a decade in which mainstream American childhood was organised, scheduled, and aimed at a specific future. School led to college, led to career, led to the same life your parents had led, in a house like the one you grew up in a town not entirely unlike the town you came from. The commune child had none of this trajectory. They woke when they woke, ate when food was available, played in the fields and the barn and the garden and the workshop, with the unsupervised confidence of small people who have never been told that certain spaces are not for them. The outdoor life was extraordinary for them, and this is not a small thing. They knew where the birds nested. They knew which mushrooms the adults said not to touch, and where those mushrooms grew, which is a form of knowledge. They could identify 20 plants by sight and knew which ones had uses and which ones were just there, growing the way things grow when nobody has decided yet what they are for. They helped in the garden with the seriousness that very young children bring to real work when they are trusted with it. Actual tasks, not simplified tasks, not pretend tasks, but the real carrying and planting and watering that actually needed to happen. They were useful, and they knew they were useful, and this gave them a quality of groundedness that the adults around them, many of whom were in the middle of reconstructing their own identities from scratch, quietly envied. The education question was the most contested. Some communes had a school of sorts, a designated learning space, a member who took on teaching, a loose curriculum organised around the idea that children should learn what interested them, rather than what a standardised system had decided they needed to know. These schools produced children who could explain the water cycle from direct observation, build a simple structure from wood, and discuss the principles of cooperative living with more fluency than most adults, but who might arrive at age 10 without having formally encountered long division. Whether this was a problem depended entirely on what you thought long division was for. Other communes sent their children to the local school in town, which created its own complications. The commune children arrived at the schoolhouse wearing clothes that the other children noticed, carrying lunches that were different, using words and references that did not map onto the world the other children inhabited. They were curious and confident and socially unusual in ways that the school environment did not always know what to do with. Some thrived. Some struggled quietly and said nothing about it at home because home was a place where struggle was processed collectively, and there was no privacy in which to be simply, personally unhappy. What the commune gave its children, whatever its educational shortcomings, was the deep knowledge that the world could be organised differently. That the arrangements most people accepted as natural were choices, not inevitabilities. That work could be shared and life could be communal, and the question of how people should live together was worth taking seriously. Some of those children carried that knowledge their whole lives, into classrooms and clinics and workshops and community organisations, and built things from it that their parents, standing in the mud beside the goat pen, had not yet imagined but would have recognised immediately. Word travelled. In the late 1960s, information about communes spread through underground newspapers, folk music circuits, hitchhiking networks, and a loose web of people who all seemed to know someone who knew someone who'd spent a month somewhere beautiful and free. The result was that established communes became destinations, and not always for people whose values aligned neatly with the existing community. Some visitors were wonderful. They brought skills, energy, fresh perspectives, and a willingness to dig ditches. Others arrived expecting the commune to be a hotel that operated on vibes. They ate the communal food, offered no labour, stayed for 2 weeks without being invited to stay for 2 weeks, and left without saying goodbye, and occasionally without their portion of the dishes being washed. Managing visitors became one of the more quietly desperate logistical challenges of commune life. The wonderful visitors were genuinely wonderful, and the commune learned to recognise them fast. They arrived with some awareness that they were entering a working community rather than a retreat, asked what needed doing before asking what was available, and slotted into the daily rhythm with the ease of people who understood that participation was the price of admission. They brought things, seeds they had traded for somewhere else, a tool the commune was missing, a skill nobody on the property had yet, a new way of approaching a problem that the community had been circling for weeks. The best visitors left the commune slightly better than they found it, and the best of the best were eventually asked to stay, which is how the community grew in its strongest years. The difficult visitors were a more complex study in human nature. They fell into recognisable categories that commune members, after enough experience, could identify within the first hour of arrival. There was the seeker, genuinely searching for something, open and earnest and exhausting, who needed the commune to be the answer to a question they had not yet clearly formed. The seeker ate your food and your energy in roughly equal proportions, and left when the commune failed to be the revelation they had been expecting, which it always eventually did. There was the ideological tourist, someone who had read the right books and wanted to observe the experiment from close range without fully entering it, who asked probing questions at meetings and offered sophisticated analyses of the commune's contradictions while contributing nothing to the woodpile. And then there was the category that communes whispered about in the specific tired voice of people who have been here before, the person who simply did not leave. They arrived for a weekend, stayed a week, stayed a month, integrated into the daily life of the commune at the level of presence but not at the level of labour, and responded to any gentle inquiry about their plans with a serenity that suggested the question itself was a form of attachment to outcomes. The commune's commitment to openness made it structurally vulnerable to this person. You could not turn someone away without a meeting. The meeting required consensus. The person in question was usually at the meeting, often speaking eloquently about the importance of unconditional welcome. The visitor policy, when it was finally, exhaustedly drafted and added to the founding document after the 4th or 5th iteration of this experience, attempted to balance the commune's genuine commitment to hospitality with its practical need to survive. Visitors were welcome for a specific period. Visitors were expected to contribute labour proportional to their stay. Extended stays required a community conversation. None of this was unreasonable. All of it required enforcement by people who had chosen this life specifically because they were tired of the systems that required enforcement. The tension was permanent and productively unresolved. What the visitor problem taught the commune was something about the difference between openness as a value and openness as a policy. As a value, it was non-negotiable. The commune believed in welcome, in the movement of people and ideas, in the door that was genuinely open rather than open in theory and closed in practice. As a policy, it needed edges, and finding those edges without betraying the value was the work that no founding document could do for you. It had to be done in real time, with real people, on a Tuesday when the lentils were low and the dishes were undone, and a stranger in the kitchen was explaining why your current composting system reflected an unexamined relationship to waste. The 1960s did not invent the idea that altered states could facilitate spiritual insight. What the 1960s did was bring that idea to a large number of people simultaneously, equip them with a specific set of substances, and set them loose in rural properties, with a mandate to figure out the meaning of existence before dinner. Communes existed at a fascinating intersection of the countercultural spiritual revival and the psychedelic movement, and on any given evening, the line between meditation, prayer, ceremony, and a very long conversation about the nature of consciousness, while someone played the sitar, was genuinely difficult to locate. Some communes were formally spiritual, organised around Eastern religious traditions, indigenous practices, or syncretic systems cobbled together from several sources. Others were more loosely oriented toward inner exploration, which could mean anything depending on the night. LSD had arrived in the counterculture through a combination of academic research, deliberate evangelism by figures like Timothy Leary, and the particular momentum of a cultural moment that was actively looking for ways to dissolve the boundaries of the ordinary. The experiences people reported of ego dissolution, of interconnectedness, of seeing the constructed nature of the social world they had been living inside, mapped neatly onto the commune's founding values in ways that felt, to the people involved, less like coincidence and more like confirmation. The commune was the political project. The psychedelic experience was the experiential proof, or so the theory went. The reality was more variable. For some members, the experiences were genuinely transformative in the ways described, openings into a different relationship with the self, with other people, with the natural world, that persisted beyond the experience and informed the way they worked and lived and related to the community. These people carried the memory of those experiences like a compass, orienting by them in difficult moments, returning to them in conversation as a shared reference point for what this project was ultimately about. For others, the experiences were simply experiences, vivid, strange, sometimes frightening, not necessarily pointing anywhere in particular, and followed the next morning by the same dishes and the same chore chart and the same lentils that had been there before. The spiritual practices that did not involve substances were equally sincere and equally varied. Morning meditation happened on cushions in the main room before breakfast, attended by whoever was awake and inclined, which meant 3 dedicated practitioners, 2 curious newcomers, and 1 person who was not meditating but was simply too tired to move. The sitting was real, and the silence was real, and the occasional sound of the goat outside trying the fence again was real, and the meditation proceeded around all of it. Eastern traditions arrived in translation, Buddhism through Kerouac and Ginsberg, and then directly through teachers who were beginning to establish centres in American cities, Hinduism through the Hare Krishna movement, and through members who had travelled and brought practices back with them. What the commune created in its spiritual life was something distinctly its own. A patchwork tradition assembled from available materials, organised around the shared conviction that the inner life mattered, that transformation was possible, and that the project of building a different world required a corresponding project of becoming different people. Whether you got there through meditation, or through a particular long walk in the woods at dusk, or through a conversation that lasted until 2 a.m. and changed something in the way you understood yourself, the destination was roughly the same. A self that was less defended, more present, more available to the people around you. The line between the spiritual and the recreational blurred, and it blurred honestly, without much hand-wringing, because the people drawing it were working from a philosophy that was suspicious of the distinction. In a culture that had decided the personal was political, and the interior was as significant as the exterior, the experience you had sitting in a field watching the light change was not a distraction from the work. It was part of the work. Whether it was the most efficient part of the work was a different question, and one that the commune was not always in a position to answer clearly, especially toward the end of an evening when the sitar had been playing for 3 hours, and someone had just said something about time that everyone agreed was very important, but that nobody could quite reproduce in the morning. There was always music. This is not a complaint exactly, and it is not entirely a compliment. It is simply a fact of commune life, as inescapable as lentils and the chore chart. Someone was always playing guitar, not always well, not always at a time that made structural sense relative to sleep schedules or conversations, or the fact that you were trying to finish a thought. The guitar was the commune's ambient soundtrack, its emotional weather system, and its default coping mechanism for anything from boredom to grief to the need to contribute something to an evening without doing any of the actual dishes. Folk music was the dominant genre. Dylan, Baez, Seeger, Guthrie, and the sense that a chord progression could carry political weight if you meant it sincerely enough. Some communes produced genuinely talented musicians, others produced earnest, sustained strumming that became indistinguishable after a while from the sound of the wind. The guitar arrived early, typically among the first items unloaded from the founding van, before the cooking pots, and possibly before the founding document. It leaned against the wall of the main room and was understood to belong to everyone and to no one, which in practice meant it belonged to the 3 or 4 people who played it most, who developed a proprietary relationship with its tuning that they would have denied if pressed, but that expressed itself clearly in the slight tension that appeared when someone else picked it up and spent 5 minutes finding the G chord. The guitar was community property in the same way the good knife was community property, technically shared, practically associated with specific people, subject to an unspoken hierarchy of competence that the founding document had not anticipated. The music served real functions. In the evenings after dinner, when the day's work was done and the meeting had either concluded or dissolved, and the candles were burning low, music was the thing that held people together in the room, without requiring them to talk or decide or process. You could sit in the circle and listen and feel, for a while, like the project was working, like these people in this room in this field at the edge of the map were doing something that mattered, and the song was the evidence. The folk tradition the Commune drew from was explicitly political. Songs about labour and justice and the long human struggle against the forces that kept people small, and singing them together in the dark gave the evening a quality of continuity with something larger than any one commune's experiment. Original songs emerged too, because a community of people with strong feelings and a guitar will eventually start writing things down. The quality ranged widely. Some of the songs written in commune kitchens and fields during this period were genuinely good, direct and unadorned, carrying the specific emotional weight of lives being lived at close quarters, full of the particular images that only come from being somewhere long enough to really see it. Others were the musical equivalent of the founding document's most optimistic passages, full of conviction and somewhat short on craft. They were sung with equal enthusiasm regardless, because in the commune's musical economy, the sincerity of the performance carried more weight than its technical execution. The guitar also served as the commune's emotional barometer. You could tell a great deal about the state of the community on any given evening by the music being played and by who was playing it. Upbeat strumming and group singing meant things were good. The day had gone well, the meeting had resolved something, the bread had come out right. A single person playing quietly in the corner after dinner meant something else entirely, a difficult day, a hard conversation still being processed, the specific solitude of being surrounded by people and needing, briefly, not to be part of them. The commune learned to read these signals with the attentiveness of people who had no walls to retreat behind, and to leave the solitary player alone, which was its own form of generosity. The music went on late most nights, tapering rather than stopping, one player taking over from another as people drifted towards sleep, the songs getting quieter and simpler as the evening deepened. Eventually there was just one person left in the main room, playing something soft and repetitive that was less a song and more a way of being awake, a thread of sound in the dark that connected the sleeping commune to itself. You could hear it from your corner, through your curtain, and it was the last thing you heard before you slept. Not always. Beautiful, not always skilled, but always there, which was its own kind of reassurance. Every commune has a story about the meeting. Not just any meeting, the one that went too long, touched too many raw nerves, and ended with at least 2 people sleeping in the van. The communes of the 1960s operated on a principle of consensus decision-making. The idea that no decision should be made until everyone could live with it. This is a beautiful principle that functions elegantly in groups of 5 thoughtful, well-rested adults with aligned values and no history together. In a commune of 20 people with different backgrounds, different wounds, different interpretations of what living with it means, and the accumulated tensions of 6 months of very close quarters, consensus decision-making can transform a conversation about whether to get a second goat into a 4-hour reckoning with someone's unresolved feelings about their father. The meeting usually began as something else, a routine gathering with a manageable agenda, the word agenda having been replaced, you will recall, with the word intention, that started at a reasonable hour with a reasonable number of candles still unburned. The first item was addressed, the second item was addressed, and then somewhere in the third item something snagged. A word was used that landed differently than it was intended. A concern was raised that turned out to be the visible surface of a much larger concern that had been building for weeks without anyone acknowledging it directly, because acknowledging it directly would have required a meeting, and everyone was tired of meetings, so it had been processed instead through subtle shifts in kitchen behaviour and the strategic deployment of silence. Once the larger concern surfaced, it could not be resubmerged. This was the commune's gift and its affliction, a culture of emotional honesty so thoroughgoing that once something was named, it had to be seen. The person who named it was usually someone who had been sitting with it for a long time, who had chosen this moment for reasons that seemed coincidental but probably were not, and whose naming of it released something in several other people who had been sitting with adjacent things. Within 20 minutes, the meeting had migrated entirely from the original agenda item to a conversation that was simultaneously about the commune's founding principles, two people's relationship to authority, someone's childhood, the specific incident 3 weeks ago with the communal cheese, and what it meant to truly trust another person. The candles burned down and were replaced. The children, who had been asleep in the upstairs room, came downstairs one by one, assessed the situation, and either went back upstairs or installed themselves quietly in corners to listen with the wide-eyed attention of small people witnessing something that was adult and significant and not entirely safe. The guitar was not played. The lentils from dinner sat in the pot on the stove getting cold in the specific way of a meal that had outlasted the evening that made it. By midnight, the meeting had reached the stage that Commune veterans recognised as the valley, the lowest emotional point before either resolution or full collapse, characterised by long silences, people crying without apology, and the particular exhaustion of everyone having said true things and not yet knowing what to do with them. A good facilitator could guide a community through the valley to something solid on the other side, an acknowledgement, a decision, a shared understanding that changed how people moved through the space together. A mediocre meeting could stall there until the cold, and the hour forced everyone to bed, unresolved. By 2 a.m, something had either shifted or broken, and the distinction between those outcomes was not always immediately clear. People who had said hard things sat with the aftermath of having said them. People who had heard hard things sat with what they had heard. Someone made tea. Someone else went outside and sat on the step for a long time looking at the sky. The founding document was not consulted. The chore chart remained on the wall. Somewhere in the field the goat was asleep, unbothered, having escaped and returned and eaten something it shouldn't have, and solved 3 problems with a fence that nobody had asked it to solve, indifferent to the whole human drama unfolding. 20 feet away. By morning, most people were still there. That was usually enough. You wake up one morning with a sore throat, a low fever, and the specific sadness of knowing that you are sick in a place with no easy access to a pharmacy. In a commune that has ideologically distanced itself from the mainstream medical establishment, getting sick opens a door to an entire universe of alternative treatment options that range from genuinely useful to warmly optimistic to the kind of thing that makes you quietly miss ibuprofen with a passion that surprises you. Herbal teas appear. Someone with confident hands presses on points of your feet and explains that your energy is blocked. A poultice is suggested, constructed and applied to your chest with the earnestness of someone performing a sacred rite. Someone else brings broth made from the garden vegetables and sits with you in companionable silence, which is actually quite comforting even if the broth tastes like a field. The commune's medicine cabinet was, philosophically speaking, a rejection of pharmaceutical capitalism and an embrace of the traditional plant knowledge that industrial medicine had systematically displaced. In practice, it was a collection of glass jars containing dried herbs, a few reference books with handwritten annotations, a bottle of something that smelled strongly and was applied to multiple ailments, and the accumulated conviction of several members who had read widely and treated themselves and others with varying degrees of success. The herbs were real: echinacea, elderberry, yarrow, mullein for the lungs, valerian for sleep, and their properties were real, documented in traditions that long predated the pharmacy on the corner. They worked for what they worked for, which was some things and not others. The difficulty was in the diagnosis. Without a doctor, the question of what you actually had was handled through a combination of observed symptoms, reference books, and the confident opinions of whoever in the community had the most medical adjacent knowledge, which might be an herbalist, a former nursing student, someone who had read extensively on the subject, or simply the person who was most comfortable with authority in the absence of credentials. These were not the same thing, but in the warm, concerned atmosphere of a commune where someone had just brought you tea and was touching your forehead with genuine care, the distinction was easy to overlook. For most things, the ordinary illnesses of people living close together through the cold months, the colds and coughs and stomach upsets that passed through the community like weather, the commune's approach was adequate and sometimes genuinely restorative. Rest was prescribed, which was real medicine. Fluids were encouraged. The communal care itself, the fact that being sick meant being brought food and checked on and not left alone with your symptoms, had a quality that the outside world's approach to illness, in which you went to work anyway and bought cold medicine from a fluorescent-lit store, and recovered in a private apartment, simply did not offer. The serious illness was the harder question, and the commune held it with varying degrees of honesty depending on the specific community and the specific moment. Some communes had clear agreements that certain symptoms meant a trip to the nearest hospital, ideology aside. Others operated in a zone of ambiguity that occasionally resolved badly, a bacterial infection that needed antibiotics being managed with herbs, past the point where herbal management was appropriate, a mental health crisis being held communally when it needed professional support. These were the failures that later accounts recorded carefully, because they were real, and their consequences were real, and the communes that survived longest were usually the ones that learned to hold the ideology lightly enough to drive into town when someone genuinely needed driving. The sick room in the commune was anyone's corner, curtained off a little more deliberately, the mattress positioned closest to the door for ease of checking on, a chair pulled up nearby where the current caretaker could sit. You were tended to with a seriousness that felt, in its unhurried attentiveness, like something the outside world had misplaced somewhere in the transition to efficiency. People came and sat with you, not always talking, sometimes just present, the way people used to be present with. Illness before presence became inconvenient. You drank the tea, you accepted the poultice, you recovered from most things, which was both a tribute to the herbal tradition and to the simple fact that most things, given warmth and rest and someone sitting nearby, resolve on their own. Love in the commune was always the most dramatic chapter. The free love philosophy that circulated widely through the counterculture offered a vision of romantic and sexual relationships unconstrained by ownership, jealousy, or the legal and social conventions that mainstream society had constructed around coupling. What it offered in practice was a remarkably efficient system for generating extremely complicated feelings among people who were already living in very close quarters and could not simply go home to process them in private. Because there was no home to go to, you were already home. Your ex was at breakfast. The person you had complicated feelings about was at every meeting. The person who had complicated feelings about you was in charge of the bread, and the bread was the only thing standing between you and a lentil-only diet for the foreseeable future. The theory of free love arrived in the commune carried by people who had encountered it in different forms and with different emphases, some from the academic literature on alternative relationships, some from the explicitly political argument that monogamous marriage was a property relationship that reproduced capitalist structures within the intimate sphere, some simply from the expansive emotional freedom that the psychedelic experiences had opened and that they were attempting to translate into their daily lives. The conversations about it were serious and thoughtful and sometimes beautiful, genuine explorations of what it meant to love without possession, to choose connection over security, to trust another person enough not to need to contain them. And then the feelings arrived, which they always do, unannounced, and not particularly interested in theoretical frameworks. You did not mean to feel jealous. Jealousy was a capitalist construct. You had said so at the meeting where this was discussed, and you had meant it when you said it, at least in the part of yourself that was operating from the philosophical position. The other part of yourself, the part that was awake at 2 a.m. listening to sounds from the other side of the curtain, was less convinced. It turned out that the intellectual rejection of jealousy and the felt experience of jealousy were not the same thing, and the gap between them was wide enough to fall into, and several people did, and the commune held them as best it could, which was sometimes well and sometimes inadequately. Couples formed with the naturalness of people living closely together, the long days of shared work, the evenings by the fire, the particular intimacy of a life in which there were no surfaces to perform on, no dates to dress up for, no distance to maintain. You simply were who you were, all the time, in front of everyone, and if someone fell in love with who you were in that unguarded state, it tended to be a specific and serious kind of love. the kind that had seen the bad days and the tired evenings and the arguments at meetings and was still present. This was the commune's gift to its romantic relationships, an enforced authenticity that stripped away the early performance of courtship and replaced it with the unglamorous truth of two people in proximity. The dissolution of couples, in a commune, required the same emotional fluency as their formation, but was considerably less welcome. You could not break up and go separate ways, because your ways were not separate. They converged every morning at breakfast and every evening at dinner, and at every meeting in between. The commune's commitment to processing feelings openly meant that the end of a relationship became, to some degree, a communal event, not intrusively, but inescapably, because the emotional weather of 20 people living together was shared, and a storm in one corner was felt in the others. You learned, in the commune, that there was no such thing as a clean break. There was only the ongoing, imperfect, sometimes generous work of continuing to share space with someone you had loved in a particular way, and now loved differently, at close quarters, in front of everyone, for the foreseeable lentil-inflected future. Not everyone who lived in a commune had fully let go of the world they came from, and the commune, for all its talk of radical transformation, was often more permeable than its founding documents suggested. There was almost always someone with a car who made regular, slightly furtive trips into town, for hardware supplies, ostensibly, or to pick up mail from the post office box. These trips had a habit of including a stop at a diner, a newspaper read cover to cover, a phone call placed from a payphone to a parent who still didn't entirely understand where their child was or why, and the particular quiet pleasure of a cup of coffee made by someone else, served in a clean ceramic mug, with no agenda attached. The commune member would return smelling faintly of civilization, and no one would say anything, because everyone had their version of the same thing they hadn't entirely given up. The mail was its own attachment. Letters arrived at the post office box in town, from parents, from old friends who were living the lives you had not chosen, from former colleagues at jobs you had left with varying degrees of ceremony. Reading them in the van before driving back was its own private ritual, a few minutes alone with the voices of the world you had come from. Voices that were sometimes worried and sometimes proud and sometimes both in the same sentence, and that carried with them, unavoidably, the smell and sound and texture of lives that were different from this one, in ways that were sometimes appealing, and sometimes simply familiar. You folded the letters back into their envelopes and drove home along the gravel road, and when someone asked what was in the mail, you said nothing much, which was true and also not the whole truth. Some members maintained jobs of a kind, freelance work done in town at a typewriter borrowed from the library, occasional paid labour for neighbouring farms during the heavy seasons, craft sales that were personal rather than communal, small income streams that were not exactly secrets, but were not fully shared either. The commune's founding principle held that all resources should flow through the communal fund, but the practice was softer than the principle at the edges, and at the edges was where most people actually lived. You kept enough to feel on the days when the communal pantry was low and the meeting had gone 3 hours and the goat had gotten into the garden again, that you had a small and private margin of safety. You would have been embarrassed to say this directly. The feeling was true nonetheless. The parents remained a presence even in their physical absence, which is the specific power parents have and which no founding document has ever successfully addressed. They called the payphone in town, the number having been reluctantly provided after enough worried letters. The conversations followed a pattern that both parties understood. The parent asking questions that were really asking, "Are you safe and are you coming back and what is happening to you?" And the commune member answering reassuringly and with selective detail, describing the garden and the meetings and the community in terms designed to convey health and purpose, without fully conveying the mud, the cold showers, the meeting that went until 3 in the morning, and the ongoing lentil situation. What the half-in half-out member carried with them was not weakness or hypocrisy, but something more honest, the recognition that transformation was not an event but a process, and that you could be genuinely committed to a new way of living while still carrying the textures of the old one, still needing occasionally the small ordinary comforts of the world you'd come from. The diner coffee, the newspaper, the phone call to your mother, these were not betrayals of the project. They were the evidence that the people building the project were humans rather than ideals, which was both the commune's greatest limitation and its most enduring source of warmth. You drove back along the gravel road with hardware supplies and a newspaper, and the quiet residue of a cup of coffee, drunk alone in a clean booth, and you parked in the field, and you went inside, and the goat was trying the fence again, and someone was playing guitar, and the lentils were on the stove, and you were home. One of the commune's most genuine and lasting gifts was the rediscovery of making things by hand. In the context of a mid-century America built on mass production, disposability, and the replacement of handcraft with industrial convenience, the commune's workshop bench felt like an act of quiet revolution. People wove through pottery, carved wood, tooled leather, sewed, dyed fabric with plants from the garden, built furniture from salvaged lumber, and made musical instruments from materials that had no business becoming musical instruments, but somehow, occasionally did. The results were wildly uneven in quality. Some commune craft was genuinely beautiful, full of the kind of irregular humanity that machine production could never replicate, and some of it was an object lesson in why certain skills require more than enthusiasm to acquire. The workshop was usually a shed or a corner of the barn that had been cleared and equipped with salvaged tools, a workbench built by whoever had the most woodworking knowledge, and a set of shelves holding supplies in varying states of organisation. The tools were the first argument, not a loud argument, but the low persistent friction of shared equipment that needed maintaining, and was not always maintained by whoever used it last. The chisel that came back dull, the loom that someone had adjusted without telling anyone, and that took 2 hours to rethread correctly. The tools were on the communal property list. Their care was on the chore chart. You can see where this is going. Pottery was perhaps the most emblematic commune craft, partly because the wheel and the kiln were accessible and learnable, without years of apprenticeship, and partly because there was something about the directness of clay, the way it responded to pressure, the way it required both force and gentleness in a balance that shifted constantly, that resonated with the commune's broader project. You sat at the wheel, and you centred the clay, and if your attention wandered, the clay told you immediately, with a wobble that became a lean that became a collapsed wall if you did not correct it fast enough. It was the most honest feedback system most people had ever encountered. The outside world had been full of systems that told you everything was fine right up until it wasn't. The clay told you the truth every single time. The things that came off the commune's pottery wheel were functional and irregular, and marked clearly as handmade, bowls that were slightly off-round, mugs with handles that sat at angles that were mathematically imprecise, but ergonomically, mysteriously comfortable. They were used daily, washed in the communal sink, chipped slowly by the ordinary impacts of a busy kitchen, and replaced by whatever came off the wheel next. Some pieces were beautiful enough that people asked to keep them specifically, which required a delicate negotiation between personal attachment and communal property philosophy that was never quite resolved, but was usually handled with enough goodwill to produce a satisfactory outcome, which is to say, you got to keep the good bowl, and nobody made it a meeting item. Weaving and textile work attracted the members with patience, a self-selecting group because the loom required a quality of sustained repetitive attention that not everyone possessed, and that the commune's culture, with its emphasis on discussion and collective processing, did not always cultivate. The weavers tended to be quiet people, or people who became quiet at the loom, which was a different thing. They sat for hours producing cloth in patterns that were both functional and beautiful, fabric that would become clothing or curtains, or the curtains that became bedsheets that became the privacy dividers in the sleeping room. The textile work connected the commune's hands to its daily life in a way that was satisfying at a level below language, the specific pleasure of wearing something made from a material grown or raised on the same property where you slept. The craft economy, as mentioned in the segment on money, was also real. At farmers' markets and craft fairs, the commune's pottery and weavings and leatherwork and candles found buyers who valued the handmade in ways the commune had not anticipated would translate into income, but that did consistently, if modestly. There was a slight irony in selling handmade objects to people who lived the kind of life the commune had rejected. People who would display the irregular bowl on a shelf in a well-appointed kitchen as a beautiful object rather than eating lentils out of it twice a day. But the commune made peace with the irony because the money paid for seeds, and the seeds grew food, and the food kept everyone at the table, which was the whole point. What craft gave the commune, in the end, was a relationship to time and material that the consumer world had made rare. You did not buy the thing, you made it, slowly, imperfectly, with your hands, from materials you understood. The making took long enough that you thought about it while you did it. Not the complicated thoughts of the meeting room, but the simpler, older thoughts that come when your hands are occupied and your mind is following along. By the time you finished, the object carried something of the hours spent on it, the specific quality of attention given to it, and you could feel that when you held it, which was why handmade things felt different even before you knew they were handmade. The commune knew this not as theory but as fact, worn into the calluses of everyone who sat at the wheel long enough. 3 miles down the road, or 7 or 14, depending on the commune, was a town. A real town with a post office, a feed store, a diner where the same 4 people had breakfast every morning and had been doing so for 20 years, and a collective attitude toward the commune that ranged from bemused tolerance to a specific low-level wariness that never quite turned into hostility, but never quite warmed into acceptance either. The commune needed the town. It needed the feed store for supplies it couldn't grow or make, the post office for the mail that tied members to the lives they'd half left behind, and the occasional emergency trip to the hardware store when whatever the commune member with the engineering degree had built turned out to require one more part. The town did not exactly need the commune, but it noticed it, watched it, with the careful, peripheral attention of a community that had seen things come and go and was not yet willing to decide which category this was. The feed store was the most functional relationship. You needed seed, feed, wire, tools, and the particular knowledge of what grew in this specific valley and what did not. And the man behind the counter at the feed store had been accumulating that knowledge for 40 years and was willing to share it if you asked correctly, which meant asking without the slightly condescending quality that some commune members brought to their interactions with townspeople, the quality of someone who has rejected the dominant culture, but still carries its assumptions about who has knowledge worth having. The members who learned to leave that quality in the van did better. They got the seed advice and the soil recommendation, and the knowing look that preceded the information about what had failed on this particular hillside in 1953 and why. The diner was its own education. You could go to the diner for breakfast in the way that the town went to the diner for breakfast, sitting at the counter, ordering eggs and coffee, existing in the ordinary rhythm of a weekday morning in a small American town, and for the duration of that breakfast you were, more or less, not a commune member. You were a person eating eggs. The counter regulars noted your presence without addressing it directly, which is the specific social grace of people who live in small communities and have learned that direct acknowledgement of the unusual thing sometimes causes more disruption than the unusual thing itself. You ate your eggs, you drank your coffee, you left a tip that was correct by the standards of the establishment, which you had looked up because you genuinely did not know and did not want to get it wrong. You drove back along the gravel road feeling briefly like a person who had 2 lives and was managing both. The children were the bridge that the adults could not quite be. When commune children appeared in town, at the school, at the general store, at the library that the commune used heavily, and that the librarian quietly appreciated because commune members read seriously and returned things on time, they were simply children, and the town's relationship to children was warmer and less complicated than its relationship to their parents' choices. Teachers noted that commune children were curious and confident, and sometimes behind on specific academic skills and ahead on others, and treated them accordingly, which is what good teachers do. The librarian let them stay until closing time. The woman at the general store gave them penny candy from a jar on the counter that she gave to all the children who came in without distinction. Tension surfaced occasionally, because they always do when 2 communities with different values share a small geography. The noise of communal gatherings carried on summer nights, the van parked on the road shoulder. The chickens that were always escaping the commune's property and appearing in places where chickens were not expected or wanted. The local newspaper ran a story once, not hostile exactly, but written in the tone of an anthropologist describing an unusual tribe, and the commune members read it and were by turns amused and offended, and then had a meeting about it that went an hour longer than necessary. The town read the story and mostly moved on because the town had its own concerns, and the commune was, in the full ledger of those concerns, a minor entry. What the commune and the town built between them over the years of proximity was not friendship exactly, but something adjacent to it, a mutual acknowledgement that they were both there, both real, both engaged in the project of living, and that the project was large enough to contain very different approaches without anyone needing to be wrong. The commune bought its feed from the feed store and its nails from the hardware store, and its library books from the library and its eggs on the weeks when the commune's own chickens were underperforming, and the town received this commerce with the dignified neutrality of places that have always understood that people need things and that providing things is its own form of community. Whatever you think of the people being provided for, some people stayed for decades, some stayed for a summer, most stayed for somewhere in between, long enough to be changed, short enough to retain the skills required to re-enter the world they had left with at least some of their references intact. Leaving a commune was its own strange passage, the inverse of arriving. When you arrived, you shed something, the schedule, the privacy, the small certainties of your previous life. When you left, you had to figure out what to pick back up, and some of it no longer fit. Former commune members re-entering mainstream American life in the 1970s describe a specific dislocation. The world outside seemed louder, faster, more certain of itself, and somehow less real than the muddy, complicated, argument-prone community they had come from. The grocery store was overwhelming. The silence of a private apartment could feel less like peace, and more like isolation. The decision to leave was rarely clean. It arrived gradually, as most true decisions do, accumulating over weeks or months in the form of small recognitions that your relationship to the commune had shifted, that you were going through the motions of meetings with less investment than you had brought to them 6 months ago, that the lentils had stopped being fine and started being a grievance, that the thing you had come here to find had either been found or confirmed as not findable in this particular location, or simply that you were tired in a way that a night's sleep on a sagging mattress was not going to address. You did not announce the decision the moment you made it, because announcing it required a process and you were tired of processes. You sat with it for a while and let it become certain. The leaving conversation, when it happened, was its own kind of commune meeting, smaller and more personal, often one-on-one before it was collective, a series of quiet conversations with the people you were closest to that had the quality of both grief and relief in roughly equal measure. People responded differently. Some were sad in a straightforward way, some were angry in a way they dressed as concern. Some had been expecting it, and received the news with a generosity that suggested they had been thinking about their own departure, and were processing both things at once. A few said nothing much and then worked alongside you with a heightened attentiveness for your remaining days, as if trying to memorize something before it changed. The practical leaving was disorienting in a different way. You had arrived with a bag and a van and a set of possessions that had been simple, because you had consciously simplified them. Now, you were leaving with roughly the same possessions plus the additions of a year or more, the handmade bowl you had been given permission to keep, the journal filled with the particular handwriting of someone in the middle of changing, the herb bundles from last summer's drying racks, a piece of woven cloth that had been a gift and that smelled, faintly and permanently, of wood smoke and the main room in winter. You loaded it into the van or the car or whatever was taking you back toward the world, and you said the goodbyes, and you drove away down the gravel road and then the paved road and then the highway, and the highway had a quality of speed and certainty that you had forgotten and that hit you like weather. The apartment, when you found one, was private and silent and entirely yours, and the privacy was welcome, and the silence was welcome, and then, 3 days in, the silence was very loud indeed. You cooked a meal for one and ate it at a table by yourself, and it was fine, and also nothing like dinner at the commune, which had been chaotic and argumentative and occasionally insufficient and almost always warm in the way that only shared things can be warm. You went to the grocery store and stood in front of a wall of choices and felt something that took a while to name. Not overwhelm exactly, but grief for a world in which the question of what to eat had been simple because it was communal, and the answer had been lentils, and the lentils had been enough. What you carried back with you was not the ideology, not the whole of it, not the parts that had required 20 people and a goat and a specific piece of land to function. What you carried was smaller and more durable, the knowledge that food grown by your own hands tasted different, that decisions made together, however slowly, had a quality that decisions made alone lacked. That silence was available even in a room full of people, if you had learned how to find it, that the life you had returned to was one arrangement among many possible arrangements, not the natural order of things, but a choice, revisable, worth examining. You had examined it. You were choosing it again, differently, with the specific knowledge of someone who had stood for a year or more in a field in the dark and looked at the stars and understood in your body rather than your head, that the world was large and the arrangements were ours to make. It is very easy, from a comfortable distance of several decades, to catalogue the ways communes failed. The idealism that outpaced the practical knowledge, the interpersonal conflicts that no amount of philosophy could fully dissolve, the experiments that ended in disappointment or dissolution. It is somewhat harder to acknowledge, with equal honesty, what the communes of the 1960s and early 70s actually got right, and there was more of it than popular memory tends to hold. The communal living experiments of this era helped seed the organic farming movement, the cooperative housing movement, early environmental activism, alternative education models, and a wide range of practices around consensus governance and conflict resolution that are still in use today. The people who lived through this period and came out the other side carrying its lessons forward built things that lasted: food co-ops, progressive schools, ecological farms, land trusts. The organic farming connection is the most direct and the most documentable. The communes of the 1960s grew food without pesticides, not because they had read peer-reviewed literature on chemical agriculture's long-term effects on soil biology, though some had, but because pesticides were part of the industrial food system they had rejected, and rejection was the available tool. What they discovered, working the land year after year with techniques drawn from older traditions and from each other's accumulated observation, was that the soil responded to care in ways that the chemical model could not replicate. Cover crops, composting, crop rotation, companion planting, these were not invented by the communes, but the communes practiced them at scale, and with the kind of obsessive attention that comes from people who are eating what they grow, and the practices spread outward through the networks the communes were embedded in. And some of those practices are now standard in farms that would not recognise their debt to a muddy collective in Vermont in 1969. The food cooperative movement owes a similar debt, less acknowledged, and equally real. Members who left communes often settled in cities and brought with them the experience of collective food procurement, the communal pantry, the bulk buying, the relationship to food as a shared resource rather than an individual transaction, and turned that experience into the first generation of urban food cooperatives that still exist in many American cities. These co-ops fed neighbourhoods, created economic alternatives to corporate grocery chains, and demonstrated at the community scale what the communes had demonstrated at the household scale, that people could organise their relationship to food differently, and the different organisation was better in ways that were measurable. The educational experiments were more uneven in their outcomes, but more interesting in their ambitions. The free schools that grew from commune educational philosophy, places that rejected standardised curriculum, compulsory attendance, and teacher authority in favour of self-directed learning, mixed age groupings, and the idea that children were inherently motivated to learn what they needed to learn, produced graduates who were wildly divergent in their academic profiles and consistently remarkable in their capacity for independent thought. Whether that was a tribute to the educational model or to the kinds of families that chose it is a question that researchers are still working through. What is not in question is that those schools forced the mainstream educational establishment to take seriously questions about motivation, autonomy, and the purpose of education that it had not previously considered worth asking. The conflict resolution practices may be the least visible legacy and the most pervasive. The commune's commitment to processing disagreement openly, to surfacing the emotional content beneath the practical conflict, to reaching decisions through genuine consensus rather than majority rule or authority, these practices were imperfect and slow and occasionally maddening, as documented extensively in the segments above. They were also, for the people who learned them, transformative. Those people carried the practices into workplaces and organisations and communities of every kind, and the practices spread, and they are now taught in schools and used in non-profits and community organisations and conflict mediation practices around the world, often without anyone tracing the lineage back to a meeting room in 1968, where 20 tired people on the floor talked until 3 a.m. about whether the word agenda implied hierarchy. It did not solve the problem that night. It planted something that is still growing. By the time the dishes are done and the last meeting has dissolved, not concluded exactly but dissolved, like sugar in warm water, the agenda unfinished but the energy exhausted, the commune settles into the night in a way that is different from any other kind of quiet you have ever known. The fire burns low in the main room. Someone is still playing guitar, softly now, a single chord progression repeating like breathing. Outside, the stars are extraordinary. The light pollution of the city is far away, and the sky here is the kind that makes you feel both very small and strangely fine about it. The goat is in its pen. The garden is out there in the dark, doing whatever vegetables do in the dark, which is apparently enough. Around you, in their corners and their curtained spaces and their sleeping bags on the floor, 17 or 20 or 23 people are settling into sleep in the particular way of people who have spent their energy on something they believe in, arguing about it, building it, tending to it, disagreeing about its shape, and showing up again tomorrow to try once more. The night on the commune had a quality that daytime could not fully hold. During the day there was always something to do, always someone to talk to, always the awareness of the shared project pressing against you with its demands and its complications, and its ongoing need for labour and attention. At night, the project rested. The fields were dark, the workshop was quiet. The chore chart was not visible in the dark and so could not reproach anyone. What remained was the simpler thing underneath all of it, the fact of being alive in a place with other people, under a sky that was genuinely indifferent to whether the founding document had been revised correctly. The fire in the main room burned down slowly, attended less and less as the evening deepened. Someone added a log in the middle of the night. This was the unofficial task of whoever slept closest to the hearth, an arrangement that had arrived through habit rather than meeting, and that had therefore stuck in the way that uncontested habits do. The fire's light moved on the walls and the ceiling, warming the faces of people already asleep, and the room held its warmth longer than it had any structural right to, because 20 people sleeping in a room is its own kind of hearth, and the walls, draughty as they were, held the collected warmth of all that breathing. Outside, the property had its own night sounds, the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the land talking to itself, the occasional territorial assertion of a bird in the dark, the rustle of something small moving through the garden with its own agenda that had nothing to do with the commune's agenda. The land at night felt older than the commune, older than the decade, older than the questions that had brought everyone here. It felt like what it was, a piece of earth that had been here long before anyone arrived with a manifesto, and would be here after everyone left, in whatever form the leaving eventually took. The person, still playing guitar in the main room, played quieter and quieter as the hours passed, the songs losing their shape and becoming something simpler, not a song anymore, but a sound, a presence, a thread connecting the waking to the sleeping in a room where both were happening at once. If you were still awake, you could hear the breathing of the people around you, and the fire settling and the guitar softening, and outside the creek, and the birds, and the enormous indifferent sky, and all of it together produced something that was not quite peace, but was the closest thing to it that this life, in all its muddy and argumentative and lentil-inflected specificity, reliably offered. You'd been here long enough by now to know what morning would bring. The kitchen crowded early, the stove demanding, the chore chart its usual work of fiction, the goat almost certainly already testing the fence, the meeting that would be scheduled for evening already accumulating its items. You knew this and you were not dismayed by it. Not tonight, lying in the dark with the warmth of the room around you, and the guitar fading into something almost below hearing. The day had been difficult in the ordinary ways, and rich in the ways that only close shared living could produce, and you had arrived again at this moment, the night's edge, the fire low, the stars outside, the people sleeping, and it was enough. Not the dream you had driven toward, something more specific than a dream. Something that had required mud and argument and cold showers and lentils, and the sustained willingness to try, and that had given back, in the dark quiet of the commune night, something you did not yet have a name for, but that you carried, intact, for the rest of your life. For a community built on the radical rejection of hierarchy, the commune had a surprisingly robust hierarchy. It just didn't have a name, because naming it would have required a meeting, and the meeting would have gotten complicated very quickly. The hierarchy wasn't written down anywhere. It wasn't on the chore chart or enshrined in the founding document. But everyone felt it. It organised itself around a few recognisable currencies. How long you'd been there, how much you'd read, how confidently you could cite Marcuse or Kropotkin, or the I Ching in a conversation, and whether you had the particular quality of calm certainty that the communal culture had decided, without discussion, was a form of wisdom rather than just a personality type. The person who had been at the commune the longest was not technically in charge of anything. They simply knew where the tools were kept, remembered the decisions that had already been made and reversed and made again, and had the quiet authority of someone who had already outlasted 3 founding members and 2 goats. The reading list was its own sorting mechanism. The commune's bookshelf, a set of planks nailed to the wall in the main room loaded with paperbacks that had been carried in from many different lives, was a portrait of the intellectual landscape the community inhabited. Marx and Engels sat beside Alan Watts. Herbert Marcuse leaned against Carlos Castaneda. Paul Goodman shared a shelf with the Whole Earth catalogue, which was less a book and more a bible of practical counterculture, its pages soft from used and annotated in 3 different hands. If you had read the right things and could reference them naturally in conversation, you occupied a higher position on the invisible ladder regardless of how you performed on the chore chart. The women who held intellectual authority in the commune did so against a resistance that the community's stated values made invisible, but that was real and palpable to anyone paying attention. The commune's philosophy included the liberation of women from traditional roles, which was genuine and meant and partially practiced. Women cooked less than they might have in a conventional household, were not expected to manage the domestic sphere alone, and participated in meetings and decisions as full members. But the intellectual prestige, the particular authority conferred by the ability to hold a room with an argument, flowed more easily toward the men, as it did everywhere in this culture, and the women who claimed it anyway had to claim it more explicitly, with more visible effort, against a subtle current that the community would have denied if you named it, and that operated nonetheless. The elder member, and every long-running commune had one, the person who had been there from nearly the beginning, and who carried the community's history in their memory, held a specific kind of authority that was the most legitimate of all the illegitimate hierarchies, because it was rooted in actual knowledge and actual experience. They remembered what had been tried before. They remembered the visitor who had seemed wonderful and turned out badly, the crop that had failed in this field in this specific way, the structural argument that had torn the previous version of the community apart, and that the current version was in danger of recreating. When they spoke in meetings, people listened with a quality of attention they did not always give to others, and the elders' measured pace and careful phrasing were understood as earned rather than performed. The newest member was, predictably, at the bottom of the invisible ladder, and navigating upward required a specific combination of demonstrated competence, ideological fluency, and the patience to be wrong publicly in the early months and continue showing up. The commune was not unkind to its newest members. The culture of welcome was genuine, and the warmth of being included in a project was real. But the welcome had a quality of provisionalness that only time could address, and until time had addressed it, the newest member sat in the outer ring of the meeting circle, and listened more than they spoke and carried extra weight on the chore chart, in the way that new people in any community do, proving themselves through the unglamorous labour that nobody else wants before graduating to the more interesting work. None of this was intentional. None of it was codified. None of it would have survived a direct challenge in a meeting, because a direct challenge in a meeting would have required the community to look at it, and looking at it would have required admitting that the community committed to radical equality had reproduced, in its own specific vocabulary and with its own specific currencies, a hierarchy recognisable to every human organisation that had ever existed. The commune preferred not to look at it directly, which is a preference it shared with every other human organisation that has ever existed, and which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about the gap between the world we build in words and the world we build in practice, in the day-to-day weight of who gets listened to and who does the dishes. The brochure for commune life, metaphorically speaking, was always a summer document. It was all golden light through tall grasses and bare feet on warm earth, and the sense that the natural world was a generous, abundant partner in this experiment. Nobody put the winter on the brochure, not the specific, relentless, seeping cold of a rural building that was insulated with ideology rather than actual insulation. Not the way the mud went from a nuisance to a permanent condition of existence somewhere around November, coating everything: boots, floors, the dog, the hem of every pair of pants ever owned by anyone on the property. Not the way the days shortened until it felt like you had approximately 45 minutes of usable daylight before the world went grey and then black, and you were back inside with 17 people and the guitar, again, still, forever. Summer communes were experiments in freedom. Winter communes were experiments in what you were actually made of. The cold arrived with the particular confidence of something that had been there before you and would be there after you. The farmhouse, charming and full of character in September, revealed its character more fully in November. The gaps in the window frames that had been decorative in warm weather became personal in cold weather, delivering thin fingers of outside air to any face foolish enough to sleep near the exterior wall. The insulation, where it existed imperfectly, and was supplemented by the commune's standard approach to structural problems, additional layers of whatever material was available, applied with determination and without a contractor's input. Blankets were nailed over drafty spots. Cardboard made a brief appearance as a thermal solution before being recognised as also a fire hazard and quietly removed. Firewood became the winter's central preoccupation, not because anyone had failed to understand that winter required firewood, but because the gap between understanding that and having enough was wider than expected the first time, and then, in subsequent years, was closed through the specific education of having been cold. The wood needed to be cut and split and stacked and dried and carried, and all of those steps required labour, and the labour was distributed according to the chore chart, which you're by now familiar with as a document of aspirational rather than descriptive accuracy. What actually happened was that the people who felt the cold most acutely cut and carried the most wood, which was a self-selecting system of rough justice that the founding document would not have endorsed, but that kept the fire burning. The fire itself, the main hearth in the common room, became in winter the commune's gravitational centre in a way it was not in other seasons. People arranged their activities around it with the unself-conscious practicality of cats, occupying the warmest spots, migrating toward the heat when the cold pushed in from the walls, reading and talking and mending things and just sitting in the fire's orbit because it was the warmest place, and warmth was now the primary value. The communal sleeping room, full of bodies, was actually warmer than the main room on the coldest nights, which led to a winter migration of activities toward the sleeping space that slightly collapsed the distinction between the room for sleeping and the room for everything else. The winter also compressed the community psychologically in ways that summer's openness had not prepared anyone for. In summer, you could escape, to the garden, to the fields, to the long walks that dissolved difficult feelings in landscape and distance. In winter, escape required more intention and more cold tolerance than most people could consistently summon, which meant that what was difficult in summer became more difficult in winter, and the meeting that had gone to midnight in September now had no outdoor air to dissolve into at its conclusion, only the same room with the same fire and the same people who would be there at breakfast. The commune's capacity for processing interpersonal difficulty was tested most severely in February, which experienced commune members knew and newer members discovered, and the discovering was its own kind of winter. What winter gave back for all its austerity was a quality of mutual dependence that summer's ease could not produce. You needed each other more specifically and more physically in winter, for the warmth of shared space, for the labour of wood and water, for the company that made the long dark evenings endurable. The songs played by the fire in February had a different quality than the songs played on the porch in July, a lower warmth, less exuberant, more sustaining. The soup was better in winter because everyone was hungry in a more serious way. The bread that came out right was a genuine event. You looked at the people across the fire from you and felt some nights a gratitude for their presence that the comfortable months had not made available, and that gratitude was the winter's truest and most lasting gift. Somewhere between the chore chart and the lentil soup and the meeting that never ended, most communes made space for something quieter. The spiritual and contemplative practices that flourished in commune life during this period were a remarkable patchwork. Buddhism arrived early and stayed, brought by members who had read Alan Watts or spent time in Zen centres on the West Coast. Yoga was practiced in its pre-Instagram, deeply unglamorous original form, on wool blankets on uneven floors, led by whoever had read the most about it. Chanting sessions happened in the evening sometimes. Circles of people producing sounds that their neighbours and their previous selves would have found impossible to explain. Silence was practiced, formal agreed-upon silence at meals or in the early morning, a collective pause in a life that was otherwise never, ever quiet. The sincerity of it was real, even when the form was improvised, even when 3 different people in the same circle were practicing 3 different things and calling it the same thing. The morning sitting happened early, before the kitchen filled and the day's demands began arriving. 5 or 6 people, sometimes fewer, arranged themselves on cushions or folded blankets on the main room floor, facing whatever direction had been agreed to constitute east, and sat in silence for a period that varied depending on who was facilitating and how cold the room was. The sitting was simple in concept, and surprisingly difficult in practice, not because of physical discomfort, though the uneven floor provided that reliably, but because the mind, placed in silence, turned out to have a great deal to say. Years of cultural conditioning toward productivity and noise did not dissolve in a week or a month. The mind continued to generate its commentary on the meeting last night and the bread this morning and the specific quality of the quiet and whether the quiet was being done correctly, and the practice was in noticing all of this without following it, which was simple to describe and took years to do with any reliability. The Buddhism that arrived at communes in this period was a Buddhism already in translation, filtered through American writers and academics, and countercultural teachers who had encountered it in different forms and carried it back in different containers. Alan Watts brought a Zen sensibility that emphasized the absurdity and the lightness of the project of self, the way the harder you tried to find the self, the more it receded. D.T. Suzuki's writings on Zen had been circulating in intellectual circles since the 50s, and were on commune bookshelves alongside everything else. Thich Nhat Hanh's early writings on engaged Buddhism, which connected contemplative practice directly to political action, had particular resonance in communities that were trying to hold both the inner transformation and the outer project simultaneously. Yoga was practiced with a seriousness that had nothing to do with the aesthetic it would later acquire. There were no matching sets of expensive clothing, no heated studio, no instructor with professional certification, and a curated playlist. There was a book, usually B.K.S. Iyinger's recently translated manual, and a person who had worked through enough of it to guide others, and a floor that was clean enough if you did not look too closely, and a group of people contorting themselves into positions that their bodies were not fully prepared for with the earnest determination of people who believed that the body was a site of liberation as much as the mind. The stiffness of people who had been doing physical labour all day contended with the demands of the postures, with results that were ungainly and genuine, and occasionally productive of an injury that required the commune's herbal medicine cabinet. What the contemplative practices gave the commune was something the meetings could not give, a relationship to the self that was not mediated by collective process. In the sitting, in the yoga, in the chanting that happened in the evenings with its vibrations moving through the chest and the floor beneath you, you were returned, briefly, to a privacy that your curtained corner could only approximate. You were alone in the way that you could be alone in a room full of people, when everyone was doing the same thing quietly. The practice did not solve the commune's problems. It did not fix the chore chart or resolve the meeting or make the winter shorter. It offered, reliably and without drama, a place to put things down for a while, the concerns and the frictions and the specific fatigue of living so closely with so many, and the putting down, done regularly, made the picking back up when morning came and the stove needed lighting and the goat needed catching marginally more possible. In the beginning there was the vision. The commune's original purpose, whatever it had been articulated in the first excited conversations that led to this particular field, this particular collection of people, this particular set of beliefs about what was possible, had the quality of something luminous and total. It was going to be different here. Not just different from the suburbs or the office or the 9-to-5 cycle, but different in a way that mattered, that proved something, that modelled the shape of a world that hadn't been built yet but needed to be. Somewhere around month 4 the vision was still present. You could still feel it on good days and good moments, in the garden when the light was right, in the rare meeting that actually resolved something, in the laughter after dinner when everyone was fed and no one was arguing and the guitar was being played by someone who actually knew how. But the vision had acquired company. It lived alongside the leaking roof, the generator that needed a part, the question of what to do about the member who wasn't pulling their weight on the chore chart, and the slowly dawning recognition that transformation was not an event, but an extremely long, extremely unglamorous process. The manifesto, in its original form, was written in a register of language that belonged to a particular moment, the late 1960s, when the vocabulary of liberation was fresh and charged with the conviction that saying things clearly enough and meaning them deeply enough could change the material conditions of the world. It spoke of the commune as a proof of concept for a different civilization, as a living demonstration that human beings could organise themselves without exploitation, without hierarchy, without the mutual suspicion that capitalism had installed at the centre of every relationship. Reading it years later, you could feel both its sincerity and its inexperience, the specific inexperience of people who had not yet discovered what the ideas cost to practice, and were therefore able to state them with a completeness that practice would later complicate. The grocery list occupied a different register entirely. It was written on whatever paper was available, the back of an envelope, a torn corner of the previous week's list, occasionally the margins of a notebook that had been meant for something more elevated. It was written fast by whoever was going to town that day, in the compressed language of practical necessity. Oats, salt, lamp oil, nails, wire for the fence, the small things that the commune could not grow or make, and that required the specific indignity of a transaction with the commercial world it had theoretically left behind. The grocery list was honest in the way that the manifesto tried to be, but couldn't quite manage. It said exactly what was needed, in the quantity needed without rhetoric or aspiration, because the lamp needed oil tonight and there was no revolutionary framework for oil. The distance between the manifesto and the grocery list was the distance the commune travelled, daily and without ceremony, between its vision of itself and its practice of itself. It was not a failure. It was the basic condition of any ambitious human project, the gap between the world you intend to build and the world you actually inhabit while building it. A gap that required not closing but living in, with as much honesty and as much humour as you could manage. The commune members who handled this gap best were the ones who could hold both documents simultaneously, who had not stopped believing in the manifesto, but who could also write the grocery list without treating it as a defeat, who understood that salt and lamp oil were as much a part of the revolution as the theory, because the revolution had to eat and see by lamplight, and the revolution's generator needed a specific part that you could only get from the hardware store in town. The vision changed shape over time. It became less total and more particular, less about proving that a different civilization was possible, and more about doing a specific set of things well in a specific place with specific people, growing food carefully and building things with attention, and resolving disagreements honestly and showing up again tomorrow. This was smaller than the manifesto had promised and larger than the grocery list acknowledged, and it was, in its diminished and specific and ongoing dailiness, enough. Not the proof of concept for a new world. Something more modest and more durable, a set of practices, a quality of attention, a way of relating to the people you were with and the land you were on that persisted after the commune dissolved, carried forward in the people who had lived it into whatever came next, and that's where we leave it. The fire burned low, the guitar finally stopped, and somewhere out in the dark the goat was asleep in its pen, which meant tomorrow it would escape again, eat something it shouldn't, and walk through a door someone had left open during a meeting about something important. And the meeting would resume, and the lentils would be on the stove, and everyone would show up again, which is the part that mattered most and got talked about least. The 1960s commune was not the revolution it said it was. It was also not the failure that history decided it was. It was something more ordinary and more interesting than either, a group of people trying to live differently, in the mud together, with limited hot water and unlimited opinions, building something they couldn't quite name but could feel on the good days, when the bread came out right and the tomatoes were ripe and the meeting was actually over. You can go to sleep now. Whatever you were carrying today, the unfinished things, the decisions pending, the conversation you're not sure how it landed, you can put it down. Not forever. Just for tonight. You don't have to resolve it right now. You don't have to figure out whose turn it is with the dishes or whether the word agenda implies hierarchy or what you're supposed to do next. The stars are very big out here past the edge of the gravel road. The world is doing what it does in the dark, which is apparently enough. Thank you for spending this time with Just Sleep Stories. If you enjoyed tonight, subscribing and leaving a comment costs you nothing and means more than you'd think. Tell me where you are and what time it is and whether you'd have lasted a week on lentils. I like knowing you're out there. Sleep well. The goat is, against all odds, contained. Good night.